So now it's my pleasure to introduce you today's speaker, um, Dr. Jonathan Kellogg, Dr. Natasha Hardy, and Dr. Jennifer Sunday. So Jonathan Kellogg is the organizer of this session. He's a science communication coordinator with the Hawkeye Institute and CU's Pacific, which is based in Vancouver, BC. Jonathan has previously co-hosted session for MEOPAR on mental health and work-life balance. Natasha Hardy is a MEOPAR postdoctoral fellowship award winner at the University of Alberta. Her postdoctoral work focuses on developing new tools to forecast marine food web trophics, trophodynamics under climate change in the California current large marine ecosystem in collaboration with Stanford University and NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Her research spans from planktonic organisms to fish and seals in our native southeastern Australia. Jennifer Sunday is an assistant professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Biology at McGill University. She is an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow in Ocean Science and a Hawkeye Institute Research Affiliate. Her research aims to understand the role of climate and global change in the distribution of biodiversity through both direct and indirect ecological responses. Dr. Vishnu Nadan was supposed to participate to this session. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us today due to a family situation. So we're thinking of him and wishing him all the best. So I'll turn the micro to the host of this session, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And thank you to MEOPAR for hosting us, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. This is something that came really, I guess, a long time ago now for me, is the idea of this session, because I didn't really have any postdocs or mentors to have a conversation with. And so my hope today is that we can really have a conversation together. So if you want to turn on your cameras, and if you want to turn on your microphones and ask a question, please do so. I hope that this video conference format will make it a little bit easier for us to have an actual discussion as the time goes on. So, like I say, this session really came about, if I think back, all the way before my general exam, my qualifying exams, because I didn't really know what life was after getting my doctorate. I knew that I wanted to do something with my PhD, but I wasn't really sure what. And it came about in part because my boss asked me, my advisor said, hey, why do you really want a PhD? What do you need this for? Because if you don't need this, you shouldn't get it. And that was a little bit confusing to me, and I didn't fully understand what he meant by that. But now having a PhD, I understand it a little bit better. And I think that's because there's actually an awful lot of jobs out there where if you have a PhD, it can actually make it more difficult for you to get that job than if you just have a master's, because you're more expensive. And so he said that I needed to do something that I didn't really want to do at the time. He said I needed to do a job search. And I hated that advice at the time, because I was like, why do I need to do a job search? I'm going to get my PhD. I'm going to go on and do great things. I'm going to just go have fun and do the research and do the things that I want to do. He said, no. You need a PhD because it's going to help you meet a goal. What is your goal? What is your dream job? You need to have something in mind that you really want to do in order to get this degree, because otherwise I'm going to say that you're going to fail your general exam and you're going to be kicked out because you don't know why you want your PhD. And that was really tough to hear, but at the same time, it ended up being some of the most important advice that I ever got, and some of the advice that I continue to give people from now on. And because, like, once I had a goal in mind of what was that job that I wanted at the end of the day, then I had a real crystallized idea of why I wanted my PhD. It motivated me to finish my degree in a much more succinct time frame than I had going up to that point. And it actually helped me say, okay, this is why I need this degree, what it's going to help open doors for me. So like, I ended up getting my degree. I said I wanted to be a science communicator. I wanted science communication jobs at the time were mostly for bachelor's and master's students, but I could see that over the years they had shifted from being bachelor's and master's degree level jobs to being more higher level PhD jobs, higher PhD level jobs. And so that was like, okay, this is why I need a PhD. I want to become a science communicator in the aquariums or in research institutes. And so I needed to have this degree because that's going to give me the credibility to talk to other scientists. Now, how did I get my first postdoc? That was a bit of a trick. My wife actually applied for a postdoc while I was out on a research cruise. And so I had so much input on it because I was out at sea. And she applied for a job in Maryland, which was going to move us from Seattle, where we were at the University of Washington, to the eastern shore of Maryland. That's a bit of a shift in terms of dynamics and topography, and I really missed topography when I was in Maryland. But we were moving to Maryland so that she could have a postdoc where she was going to be researching Alaska, because that totally makes sense. But that's the way that postdocs go. You go where there's an advisor of somebody working on something that you're excited about, and research funding doesn't really matter what university it's going to. You could be studying pretty much anywhere else in the world. But this came up with the two-body problem of what am I going to do in Maryland? Because at the time we were married, and somebody said, well, you're going to Maryland. You're going to, like, Maryland's small enough, you can work in DC and you can be like just doing something with policy there. You want to do science communication? I was like, yeah, but we're going to be on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is going to mean that it's going to be about a 2-hour drive each way in order for me to get to Washington, DC. And people were like, well, you'll see your wife on the weekends. And I'm like, that's not exactly why I got married, to see my wife on the weekends. But ultimately, turned out to be another job at the university. I was hired on as a trailing spouse, which, as in my family, that was a bit of an interesting trick. I didn't grow up thinking of myself as a trailing spouse, but sometimes that's the role that we're put into when we're in a relationship with another PhD holder. Is like sometimes you just get to swallow your pride and continue on. So Maryland was not it. The job taught me a lot about science communication, skills that I still use today. It gave me the opportunity to be actually physically close with my grandmother during her last couple of years of life, which was really, really nice. But I functionally really didn't like Maryland. I got a lot of mosquito bites, and it wasn't much fun. The highest, coming from the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, where I was born and raised, it was really hard to be in Maryland, where the highest point around was 250 feet, not even a full 100 meters, and that was a bridge. That was the highest point in a 4-hour drive. So it was just so bloody flat that it wasn't really for me. The job then moved because the lab moved from Maryland to Oregon, where I was again the trailing spouse. I was underemployed. Fortunately for me, my wife and I had decided to start a family. So we had a daughter, and I became the primary caregiver for my daughter. And that was so rewarding and really saved my mental health at the time, because functionally I was underemployed. I was only working about 10 hours a week, but it didn't really matter because I was taking care of my daughter, and she was giving me some purpose in my day. Yeah, it's when you move to someplace new, if you're moving someplace new without having anything going for you, they say it's going to take up to a year, and they're serious that it's going to take up to a year to find a job and friends, because like it just takes a lot of time. And sure enough, as we were in Oregon for about 9 months, it was about a month after I left Oregon that a job came up for me in Oregon that would have been absolutely perfect for me in science communication and science policy. But like I said, we were only there for 9 months because my wife got another postdoc in British Columbia, at the University of British Columbia. And that was awesome. But again, I was now in the position of trailing spouse and trying to build a new network around Vancouver, which again took about 6 to 9 months for me to figure things out. And I became an adjunct faculty member at the University of British Columbia for a term. And then I actually got a position at the University of Victoria, being another postdoc there, for a project with MEOPAR researcher Jay Cullen on a project talking about Fukushima radiation. So I've got plenty of experience as being a trailing spouse. I've got plenty of experience moving around a whole bunch. I've got experience trying to find that job when you are the trailing spouse and building that network. It's interesting and hard. And sure enough, I finally migrated towards a job without a term contract at Hackeye, which I got largely because my wife was a Hackeye postdoc at UBC. And so the head of Hackeye was introduced to me through my wife. And then he followed my work for some time to see if he really wanted me to work there. And now I've been at Hackeye for about 2 years. So I thank my wife a lot for my career because I've had some interesting experiences, and I've gotten a couple of jobs because I've been a trailing spouse. But like functionally, it's an interesting process to be a postdoc. And at the time of my general exam, I didn't really think I needed a postdoc at all, because to have that job search that I did back then didn't really have anything that said, hey, you need to have a postdoc in order to become a science communicator or a science communication specialist. But what I've found in the process of my postdocs and moving around a whole bunch is that those jobs have given me the training and the credibility to put on my resume that I really am a science communicator, and to transition away from hydrothermal vent research, which I was doing, into science communication as a full-time profession. So that's about all for me. Natasha, would you like to tell your story?
Yeah, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I just have some pretty pictures to distract people while I talk. Give me just a moment. Oh boy. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So I was wonderfully introduced, and thank you, Isa, for that. I'll skip the formalities, but and I'll jump into what moves me and why I got to where I did. I am an international, I am Australian, and so I can definitely speak to that experience also, as well as Jonathan. I definitely want to acknowledge the things that moved me and got me here. This is my why, this exact beach, I probably acknowledge for being as much a part of my upbringing and my reason probably for being a marine biologist as my family. It's Maroubra Beach on unceded Gadigal and Muru Ora Dial people of the Eora Nation in Eastern Australia. I definitely could never get enough of the ocean and being in it. There's definitely not a part of this beach and the coastline around it that I haven't been in, either as a diver, snorkeler, surfer, basically anything to do with the water, you name it, I was doing it. And so place for me is a big one. It was a big deciding factor in my career early on, and it still is, even now that I live in Alberta. I'm based at the University of Edmonton. I currently actually reside in Canmore in the mountains. And I am a marine biologist that is effectively landlocked at the moment, but even then, place and the natural spaces that I am lucky to be a part of truly drive what I do and continue to inspire me. I put this here because that's been an important element throughout my work, is being actually very connected and engaged with ideally the places you're working in, but if you're working remotely, there are still ways to be engaged. And in my opinion, it's important to be stoked, because that just drives my energy as a researcher as well. That passion for the ocean and my corner of the Pacific brought me into the incredible world of applied marine ecology. I found that I could miraculously get paid and develop a career around investigating and solving important questions that revolve around ecosystem function and how things work, is sort of how I started at this. And obviously I've stayed because I see so much potential for us to work on and resolve some really critical issues in a changing world. So the topic has mattered a lot to me, and this is another element that I've based a lot of decisions on, is what excites me, what gets me up in the morning. And I've said this at every step of the way, and every sort of turning point in my career and decision making has been towards thinking about what do you tell people, like your mom or your family? What are you excited about at the pub? About, for example, the next job or the project you're working on now. Both during my PhD and subsequent contracts I worked on marine predator recovery and their impacts to ecosystems, and subsequently I did a contract also that monitored seal populations in Southern Australia and looked into some wildlife conflict issues. I'm aware that this is probably the Instagram version of my career, and maybe I'm missing home or missing the field, but it wasn't just the topic and the places that I worked in that have driven me, but also people, obviously great colleagues, and you do build those connections amazingly well in the field. But I've been able to work with some really big teams of academics, government scientists, conservation practitioners, and more and more local communities. And so I did, of course, have a really great time in the field, and that changed completely as a postdoc. This is definitely more what my life looks like now, but I think it's really important to think about at that point where it's taking you and the impact that you can actually have on your field and scientific community when you're doing, I guess, high level synthetic work, potentially, and working with bigger data and even bigger teams. So after all of that, the postdoc experience still remains something murky to me, even though I am now a postdoc of 2 years. I still think there's so much to talk about and explore, what are the choices we're making? What are the better choices we could be making? And luckily, I've been able to have some great friends and mentors, and I put these 2 photos to acknowledge the 2 very awesome, at the time on the left, in the fluoro bikini, my first postdoc friend, actually, and someone who really was able to enlighten the process for me, but also show me that it was a real job and a great stepping stone to other positions, and I definitely was always willing to explain whatever questions I had. And that's Renata Ferrari, and my current supervisor, Stephanie Green, at the U of A, has so much great knowledge and experience, having done multiple postdocs overseas herself. And so I'm definitely happy to expand on that in the questions, if you have any, and share as much of their knowledge and experience that they've imparted on me, and what I've also acquired throughout the process. But ultimately, as Jonathan says, there's so much more than the individual in this process and the decisions that lead us to where we are. And for me, a really big driving factor has been my mom, someone who actually gave up a career to be a mother. And so for me, it was quite important, I guess, as a woman, to make sure that I had that. So I'll leave it at that and pass it over to Jennifer.
Awesome. This is so interesting. I'm loving hearing both of your stories. I don't have beautiful pictures to share, unfortunately, so it's just me. So when I think about just telling my story of the postdocs that I've done, and also sort of weaving in this question about place and people and family life. I can touch on all of those things a little bit as well. So at the end of my PhD was quite long, and I sort of did that on purpose. I was advised, if you're going to do, if you think you want to do some side projects and change a little bit what it is you do for your research, and if you can afford it, if you have the financial coverage, you might as well do that in your PhD instead of after your PhD. So I could expand on that a little bit more in the questions, but my PhD was in evolutionary, like speciation, evolutionary biology in the marine system. And somehow halfway through my PhD, I realized I don't like explaining this to people at cocktail parties or my family. I want to work on something that's more immediate and impactful. And so I started doing a whole bunch of side projects so I had support from my supervisor, and I had at that point was covering my funding. So I did a bunch of side projects on climate change. And some of that was applying my evolutionary background, and some of it was just totally new, but all synthetic. Nope, not all synthetic. I did an experiment too. So finding that's sort of when I started collaborating outside of my home university. So to build up the potential to be answering questions that I felt were important that I hadn't set myself up to do inside my PhD. So I finished a whole bunch of those side projects during my PhD. And that, I think, is one of the things that helped me to land postdocs, and also to just be a more well-rounded, starting to be thinking way more independently about what science I want to do and how to make that happen. So towards the end of my PhD, I was applying. I remember having a whole schedule of like different postdocs to apply for, and I at that point had collaborators and colleagues and friends in Germany and Australia. And so I applied in all those places. But in my home life, I also became pregnant, and this was the plan. I don't know why I'm telling you all this anyway. And so I also applied at UBC, thank goodness, because my partner was not interested in going to Australia or Germany at that time. And so so my PhD was at Simon Fraser University. So at that point, it seemed like I declined a couple of other postdocs and decided to stay in Vancouver. And that was sort of a savior because we just got to stay in the same place. And UBC, that was a self-funded postdoc. And so this is something worth maybe airing out, that there's two distinct types of postdocs out there. There's a self-funded one and there's a more contractual one. And a self-funded postdoc allows you to you propose it, you win the funding, and usually even if you don't do exactly what you said, it's okay. It's sort of your time to explore what you want to do in a short amount of time. And not necessarily with a giant research budget, but at least your salary covered. Whereas a contractual postdoc is, a PI or somebody who's won a big grant has a specific task that they want the postdoc to do. And those can vary in terms of how specific or general, how much you could take ownership over it. But it is different. You do feel a little bit like you need to report back to this supervisor, and there's the expectation that you're spending a certain amount of time on that project and not on finishing papers from your PhD or applying for faculty jobs. So the UBC one was a self-funded postdoc. So I published papers for my PhD and from all the collaborations I was doing, and I had a lot of fun because I sort of could be self-directed. And I collaborated with people there as well. Okay, and then I had two babies. So I had two mat leaves, and it's worth knowing that NSERC covers a certain amount of maternity leave, and many universities, but not all, also cover mat leaves in various ways. And it's very difficult to navigate the system, especially when you're like already freaking out about everything else about having a baby. So you need to reach out, basically. Other people know this stuff. And I remember being so afraid to tell people I was pregnant because I thought it would affect my career path and everything. But in the end, I mean, as soon as I did, then everybody directed me to the people who could help me navigate the financial aspects of maternity leaves. And the same, there's of course paternity leaves as well, also worth to navigate. And so UBC, there was an amazing administrator at the Biodiversity Center who just took it on. She's like, this is my job. I'm going to solve this for you. And she found the best versions of maternity leave. But that doesn't always happen, but there is institutional knowledge that's worth finding if you're in that situation. Okay, so I had 2 mat leaves. So it was a 3-year postdoc, but I was there for 5 years, basically. And then I had applied for a couple of faculty jobs and not landed one, I think, at that point. So I took another postdoc at University of Washington, and this one was a contractual postdoc. So a PI who had funding reached out and said, what are you doing after this? So that was lucky. This is through the network. I mean, you can talk for a million years about networking, and I do a lot of working group work. So this is how you can build a network in lots of places and sort of prove yourself at those working groups and those open opportunities. And so this was with Terry Klinger at the University of Washington, and she had a 1-year contract, and that was great. I thought, great, it's now, and it was totally okay with her for me to work from Vancouver. So again, I got to stay in the same place and sort of look on paper like I was somewhere else. And of course, it's not far. I was in Seattle, so I could drive down and meet with her once every 2 months about. But it was a contractual postdoc, which was very challenging for me because I was applying for jobs and writing papers and had all this other stuff to do. And it was difficult to make sure I was spending a minimum amount of time working on the project I was supposed to work on. And usually, just so you know, now I know this, when a PI applies for a grant and puts a postdoc on that grant, they usually say they expect the postdoc to work 50% on that grant, not 100%. So it's worth finding that out. What is the percentage you expect me to work? Because everyone expects a postdoc to be applying for jobs, even if it's not academic jobs, just finding the next step and publishing from previous projects. Okay, and then so that was a 1-year contract, and then I spent a lot of that time sorting out the faculty next step to a faculty. So I was fairly sure. So speaking to Jonathan's point, that I wanted a faculty position, and that, you know, it's like you want to be ambitious, but you don't know if it's going to happen. So you sort of set it out there and keep trying and start thinking about alternatives as you go. That's what I did. Yeah, so and I had a really great group of postdocs at UBC, but this didn't exist. So we had to make a postdoc network because we realized there isn't one. And so we made a listserv so we could email each other and have beers. And I hardly could go to those beers unless they were early. So, you know, I pushed hard to make the bird because my childcare would end I had to leave at 4 or 4:30. So, you know, you just advocate and you say, nope, beers has to be early and I want to come and we're going to get, and you can all work together to figure out your next steps. And there's really a lot of, it was really great to have that network of other postdocs who were also quite serious about faculty positions. And so we could practice our job talks and you know, and talk about all the paperwork in your job statement, your research interest statements and all of that. Okay, and so then I did get the job at McGill, so that's where I am now. And now is, you know, this is now, it wasn't an obvious decision for me to go because I still have so many ties to the West Coast, and my husband has a business here in Vancouver. I'm in Vancouver right now. I'm calling you from Vancouver. So, but so that of course comes back to your family life and your 2-body problem. In our case, not everybody has that, but then also where your grandparents are and where your parents are. This is all, everybody understands this is part of what motivates you. And when I remember making the decision, everyone was like, great, you're going to McGill and we're so happy for you. And, I was like, I might not go. Like, we have to talk about this. I don't think that it's so obvious because this is a huge disruption to my family life. And so I found it interesting that some people were just like, oh, the career is the obvious choice. And other people were more, of course, understand more about all the decisions about where you place your family for the unforeseeable for future. But as it turns out, I've learned now in a faculty position that everybody is from somewhere else, more or less, all of the faculty. And they go home at Christmas, they go home at summer, they travel a lot. And so they really almost sometimes they see the job as this sort of term, you're there for the teaching and for your grad students. But there is a sort of, it's been interesting to learn from that perspective that that not everybody, you can see it as a place where you do your job, but maybe your heart can still be elsewhere. Okay, I'm done.
That was awesome. Thank you both. It was really great to hear both your stories in more detail than we had in our earlier discussions. So, so now the floor is open. I invite anybody and everybody to turn on their video to have a conversation for the next, however long we have, which is about 10 or 15 minutes if you want, to ask questions of the panelists or each other, or anything that came to mind while we were talking about that kind of stuff. And you both brought up some great points about how do you get funding and what are the differences between funding. And like one of the things that I forgot to mention is that funding can be a trick and a half, no matter what job you have. So one of my elements was as an adjunct faculty member, and I was actually paid pretty well as an adjunct faculty member in integrated sciences at the University of British Columbia. But I know some of my friends were working as adjunct faculty in other places in the States, and in the States in particular, you're not paid very well there. There's one friend was teaching 3 different positions at 2 different universities, 3 different classes at 2 different universities, total of about 750 students. And her annual salary teaching full-time was about $26,000. And that's not unheard of. And so as a postdoc, you might be making more. Many Canadian postdoc salaries are in the neighborhood of about $50,000. And Laura would hurt me if I didn't mention that MEOPAR has a top up that allows you to get some independence and some freedom to have that ability to maneuver a little bit around your advisor. That's annually applied for, Rodrigo, I think. Not, yeah, twice annually. There's every 6 months, or it's a rolling thing.
It's an annual it's open annually, but then it's a 2-year, and you can get the top up for 2 years. You then have to reapply, right? And for the second year.
But funding is a trick for sure when you're a postdoc. And I see some nodding heads from the others as to how you actually make this work. And so, yeah. So Natasha, can I ask you why you thought you needed a postdoc? What is the dream job that you said, maybe I really need a postdoc because it's going to open up blank?
That's definitely a longer answer than I would give a longer answer maybe at the pub, but look, it actually came back to a 2-body problem originally. I moved to the US to be with my partner, and that ultimately didn't work out. And it turns out that being in North America with a PhD, a postdoc, was actually one of the easiest jobs to get. I wanted to explore some other options, and that wasn't easy. I also had a time limit. At some point as a foreign national, you have to go home. And so I was working under those constraints. I had always actually personally had an interest in especially the really strong research community in North America. So it was a personal goal of mine. even before I moved here for a person, to try to break into that research community here. I think ultimately my dream job, it's going to be hard to get. I think that there's a generation of scientists that got paid to do some really awesome field work, and we may or may not be in a world that will continue to pay you to go, handle seals for a living. We've got to do some more synthetic and impactful work these days. So not that it wasn't, but I think that I'm still figuring out what that ultimate dream job is going to look like. It actually could be an NGO. And that's another reason why I'm here, is that community is so strong here. In Australia, your jobs are very limited to about 7 cities. There's only 7 cities in Australia anyway. And you're limited to those universities in those cities, or CSIRO, a couple of other government bodies, very small number of NGOs. It's just taking off. I would love to be a part of the wave that brings it there someday. So that's a thing. Yeah. And I will say that it is really interesting to consider doing a postdoc internationally. That does make you very marketable back home if you're thinking on those levels as well.
Go for it, Isabel.
Yeah, just a comment from bit my experience as a postdoc, but also hearing something that is standing out from the conversation from you guys. At some point, I think the most important thing is to take time for you to sit down and think what you want your life to be. Who are you and what you want to be? And by experience, I finished my PhD at JUMP, and it was mostly in fundamental biology. And then I jumped to a first postdoc, and then my supervisor had no experience outside of academia, and she was great, but I did not know what were the other options and what was outside academia, what's outside from government job. How do I get there? And at some point when I realized my life changed, and I love and I was passionate about learning, but research was not all my life. What do I do? Where do I go? Where do I start? And that was the tipping point for me to go and look outside the box and see where to go. So I think the best advice is and it's hard. Yeah. And you're going and you never have time to settle because you keep looking for what's next and what's next. But at some point it's really worth it to sit down and what do you want to do? What do you want your life to be? What are you ready to deal with? What are you ready to compromise? And all those questions.
Yeah, I had a friend who started their postdoc. They've just finished their PhD. They started their first postdoc. They got there about 3 weeks in. They had their second or third meeting with their new advisor, and their new advisor said, "So, what jobs are you applying for?" And they were shocked. They were astonished that why would they be asked about what jobs they were applying for just 3 weeks into their first postdoc. And the advisor was like, well, you need to get started because it's going to take a while to find that next job. And this is only supposed to be for a year or 2 at most. And so you need to get working on that. And that was just it's a very unusual time. As you heard, I moved 3 times across country in and then internationally in just a year and a half. So it's an interesting time of life that it's important to think about how much you need that experience and that training in whatever the additional field is for your dream job, and what is it that you really want to do. It's also expensive because moving is not cheap. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I was going to say that one thing that's worth knowing that I didn't really appreciate until I stepped into the professor role is that in the funding landscape in Canada, professors get credit based on what 1/3 of their credit in the NSERC system is what their trainees do. where they go after. And so we spent a whole chunk of our proposals talking about all the great things our trainees are doing after they leave. So that's one of the reasons that, you know, that supervisor probably did that. They're saying like, yes, this is only lasting a year, so get your 2 years, so you're just going to take time, but also like your success is my success. So what job I want to get you to get the good job, because that looks good for me, and that if I can springboard you to the next step, then that fulfills me. So and I didn't really know that, like, and you know, nobody tells you that. Well, I'm telling you that, but I know.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ryan.
So this isn't really applied to me, but I know that a lot of people aren't even aware that teaching postdocs are a thing, which is almost exclusively focusing on teaching. And if what you want to do is to become an instructor and not necessarily a professor, that's certainly a route that you can go that doesn't necessarily bring in all the pressures of tenure track, but still gets you within the system. And you can still do research in that as well in most cases. So it's just something to consider. And I know there's a lot of good ones out there in Canada.
Rodrigo, you have a comment? Or?
Yeah, no, just something briefly too that, I mean, thank you, Jonathan and Natasha and Jennifer for sharing those experiences. It also made me think about my own sort of, I guess, experience as well. It was a question that I had early on in my career. I come from a sort of marine biology background and ecology, and it was always a question, when are you doing sort of the master's, and when are you doing the PhD, and when are you doing the postdoc? And I really struggled to make a decision at the time. At the time, I think what was different when I was going through this is that there really wasn't anything outside academia if you were to follow that path, right? It was just, if you did your PhD and a postdoc, it's basically you are going to end up in academia, and I didn't see myself there. I think that now, or at least my perception now, is that things have changed and that there are a lot of other opportunities outside academia. I've heard some of your comments about where, you know, sort of the jobs are, whether it's industry, and Isa has some experience there, whether it's also on the not-for-profit sector, or whether there's other also different paths within academia that you could follow as well. So I think that's kind of interesting to highlight, that there's probably more out there, and it really, you can still do the PhD, you can still kind of have that drive if you're thinking, and postdoc if you're thinking of, you know, of following that, and then thinking that, oh, then now I can kind of switch and move to industry, or move to the not-for-profit sector, or even government, and still kind of be able to make a career. I think I just kind of wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, thank you very much for highlighting that. So I just got notified, or we all got notified, that it's time to wrap up. I'd really like to thank everybody for coming and for participating, and I hope that you all will feel free to contact us. Like, here's our emails if you want to say hi about anything or ask us any questions. If any of our stories resonated with you and you want to understand more, ask another question, we can set up a time to chat outside of this. So thank you very much to MEOPAR for hosting this session and saying that this is an important enough topic for all of us to discuss and understand what happens after that PhD.